The Photodrama of Creation is a 4-part, 8-hour-long production which incorporates slides, phonograph records, and motion pictures. The slides are hand-colored, and many of the motion pictures were either colored by hand or by a stencil process. 24 lecture records, 2 introductory records, and several music records make up the soundtrack. About 500 slides, all of which had their color applied by hand, make up the bulk of the visual elements. However, several reels of motion picture film were also incorporated. If the photodrama were to be played without the films, as the Eureka drama was, it would run approximately 5 hours, so there are about 12 or 13 800-foot reels of film used to make up the additional 3 hours of running time of the production. Some of this film was sound synchronized using phonograph records. Examples in this production include the films of Pastor Russell and Les Rameaux, The Palms, illustrating our Lord's entry into Jerusalem. It was the first epic-length production of its kind. In 1969, I first became aware of the Photodrama of Creation as a 15-year-old through a reel-to-reel tape which was loaned to me by Brother Edward Bilecki. It had the voice of Brother Russell, as well as a few of the lectures. Then, shortly after, Brother Dan Kaziak showed our Sunday school class some of the original glass slides projected on a screen. In the early 1970s, he gave those slides to me because of my interest in the photodrama. I was becoming familiar with photography and working in a darkroom, so I made some early attempts to duplicate some of the slides in their original 3¼ by 4-inch format, mounting the film between plates of glass after hand painting them under a magnifying glass, much the same way as it was done in 1912 to 1915 when it was first produced. In 1973, Brother Walter Wojcik gave me a 35mm slide holder with 2 frames of film of Brother Russell in it. My immediate question was, is there more? I learned then, to my horror, that a brother who had the films had been cutting them up into bookmarks and slide frames as the majority of the film was deteriorating, as it was on nitrate base. I wish I knew then what I do now and had the facilities to duplicate film, but I didn't. I was still a student at college and didn't have financial resources to have the films that remained transferred to a new 35mm copy, if there were any more left. Besides, film laboratories were, and still are, very reluctant to handle nitrate stock. In 1974, Brother Lawrence Kirkham gave me a 35mm film of Brother Russell speaking. It turned out to be the introduction to Part 2. I made several attempts to copy it to 8mm and 16mm film with little success over the next 9 years. In the same year, Brother Leon Norby allowed me to borrow a 16mm film of Brother Russell giving the intermission and conclusion of Part 3. The following year, Brother Norby passed, and his wife, Sister Mary Norby, gave the film to me. Until 1982, these were all of the motion pictures I had. Then I made a trip to New Jersey with my new video recording equipment, where I recorded several interviews with brethren who had met and known Brother Russell. At one of these, held in the home of Brother August Tornquist, I showed a videotape of some of my early attempts to copy the films of Brother Russell to Brother Tornquist. He said, "I think I have something that might be of interest to you." He took me to his basement where he had 4 reels of photodrama motion picture film in cans. He gave it to me, along with a separate reel that had the original 35mm footage of Brother Russell that Brother Norby had reduced to 16mm film by one of the local film production companies. Not only did Brother Tornquist give me the films, he gave me a 35mm projector which had belonged to Brother Norby, as well as his own 16mm Bolex movie camera, so I could do a proper job of copying the 35mm films to 16mm films using animation techniques. I started on this in February 1983 and completed it by late March, a total of about 42 days of effort. Each frame of 35mm film had to be moved into position by the projector's mechanism and photographed by the 16mm camera. The film was advanced by hand. Some of the film was very brittle, and most was missing many of its perforations, so it broke often and had to be repaired. This 16mm copy was projected onto a screen and videotaped, along with 35mm slide copies of the glass slides, and a set of beta format master tapes was made in the mid-1980s. Thankfully, most of that 35mm film footage has survived to this day, Between then and 2003, about 200 feet of film had deteriorated beyond use. In 2003, I digitized all of the film footage that had not deteriorated using a Canon 10D digital camera and made the first DVD production using those frames animated in Adobe Premiere. In 2014, some additional footage was loaned to me by Mike Castro, a collector of Watchtower memorabilia. For the most part, these are bits and snatches of several of the films that were on a videotape that was recorded in a Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1980s, which I was given access to by another collector. Mike's film footage was edited into the videotaped portions for this production. In some cases, footage from Felix Alon's World's Greatest Passion Play was used, as this was clearer than the videotaped footage. The Passion Play was given to me by Sister Pacious. Sister Ruth Zabinski gave me a 16mm negative of the introduction to Part 3. This was used in places where the 35mm film record was incomplete. 35mm film copies came from Mike Castro and another collector who wishes to remain anonymous. For this new production, the projector was modified so the film could travel in a nearly straight line from the feed spool to the copying stage. This minimized breakage. Also, the original film mask was removed, allowing the entire frame to be photographed. The mask had cut off about 20% of the image from all four edges of the film in the previous digitization effort. Removing the mask makes it possible to see even more of the picture area than ever before. The films were digitized in 2016 using a 50.6 megapixel camera, a Canon 5 DSR. The films were animated in Sony Vegas, now Magix Vegas software. The films were stabilized as much as possible, matted as closely to the edges of the image as possible, and then synchronized to the original soundtrack records in the same software package. The films were rendered as 4K files, even though the resolution of the individual frames is closer to 12K. Video technology hasn't caught up with this yet. But the photodrama isn't all motion pictures. Indeed, fully 5 hours of lecture records and slides were involved. I received complete sets of the lecture records from Brother Anton Fry and Brother Wilbur N. Poe in 1976 and 1977 respectively. From that time forward, I strove to record these records as clearly as possible to reel tape. My best effort to date was used in the 1980s and 1990s videotape versions. It wasn't until the 2010s that all of the records were digitized at a 96 kHz stereo sample rate with 24-bit resolution. By that time, I had 5 full sets and another 6 partial sets of the lecture records. Music was another matter. Over the years, as the older music records wore out, the brethren would replace the old acoustically recorded records with newer electrically recorded records, which were clearer. Record companies made the switch to electrical recording, using a microphone to pick up the sound and a lathe to cut the records about 1925. This was superior to the old shout into a horn and make the needle cut the record by acoustic force of your lungs and vocal cords method, which had been employed all the way back to 1878, when playable recordings had first been made by Thomas Edison. I have, for several years, been hunting down acoustic versions of the same record titles that were used in 1914, purchased mainly from garage sales. Most of the ones used in this production are correct. Again, all of these were digitized. A couple of records were culled from the National Jukebox, part of the National Archives recording project in Washington, D.C. All of the recordings were processed somewhat to reduce but not eliminate the surface noise of the records. The idea was to make the records sound newer than they are, but not to make you feel like you are in a recording studio with the original artists, but using low-fidelity recording equipment. In the 1980s, the glass slides were photographed onto 35mm slide film. I photographed the set that Brother Dan Kaziak gave me, as well as a set that Brother Tim Armstrong loaned to me. When I was preparing the digital version, I found that I had to do this work again because the transparency film didn't reproduce the colors correctly, so they were duplicated again, both onto Kodak slide duplicating film and Vericolor professional color negative film. The negatives and slides were all put onto Kodak photo CDs and were used in the first digital version on DVD in 2004. However, most of the glass slides had defects, like cracks, dust, etc. Since the standard definition DVDs had 640 by 480 pixel resolution, it wasn't too time-consuming to retouch the slides. However, for this Blu-ray version, much more care had to be taken. For this latest effort, all of the slides were digitized once again, this time at 3200 dpi on a flatbed scanner, and then retouched with much higher resolution requirements in mind. Actually, the slide files can endure an 8K or even a 16K production as they stand now. But again, video recording and playback technology haven't caught up with digital imaging technology. By late July 2017, I was certain that I had the final master for duplication completed. However, at work, I was asked to help find some astronomical glass slides for an eclipse talk to be given at my workplace, the Benson Ford Research Center at the Henry Ford. As it turned out, they had two of the mechanical slides which were used in the first two lectures of the photodrama. I paid for the rights to use these two slides in this production. I was supplied with stills of them, both front and back. The backs of the slides allowed me to compute the gear ratios for the orrery slide. The scan of the slide was animated by creating several rings of stills of the individual planets in Photoshop. These were then individually rotated in Vega software according to the gear ratios of the original slide. The one with the zodiacal signs was much easier to animate with only the Earth to put into motion. This project has been a blessing to work on. Often I reflected on the hard work of the brethren back in the 1910 to 1914 era as they worked with the latest technology of the time to produce this spectacle. Although the method of display was primitive by today's standards, if one tries to project themselves back into the early 1900s, one can begin to appreciate the photodrama of creation as it was back then. Those who took over the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society in 1917 at Pastor Russell's death, and those who followed, have left off believing much of what is taught in this production. However, the doctrinal viewpoints of Brother Russell at that time, which are presented herein, are still appreciated by Bible students the world over, including the producer.